Welcome back to Design Santa Barbara. This week we have Erin Graffy, the Santa Barbara historian and a wealth of knowledge, and she's talking about old Spanish days and fiestas. If you could please.
Well, we were talking about, yes, that fiesta. The original name was Old Spanish Days when they started the festival in 1924. And they were basing it on their own Santa Barbara history, the previous century, and a time period that they referred to as the Old Spanish Days, when people spoke Spanish. It was actually under Mexican rule. It was after the Spanish rule, but it was under Mexican rule and into the American period. But when people still spoke Spanish here, and the majority of people were still living on the ranchos, and this was the time period that they were looking back because of the innate music that was developed here, the dances, the style of the way of life that was so unique. And it's a fascinating time period. It lasted maybe about 40 years, start to finish. And to kind of set this up, in Santa Barbara, this time period was so revered that even today when you go throughout Santa Barbara, you will notice in all the public arenas, on the walls, in the restaurants, the paintings all harken back to this time period. Now you might say, well, that's just kind of like what cities do. They put a picture of something in their history. But we don't show tons of pictures of Santa Barbara during the Wild West days or during the 1920s. It's all of this time period from around 1820s through about early 1860s that we're referencing here. And this is what you see when you go through the restaurants, when you're in El Paseo and you see the beautiful canvases in there, and it's describing visually what this time period was about. I actually wrote a book about this, The Old Spanish Days, and talks about this history. And when you go through this, all the illustrations are from our public arenas that have these images of that era captured so beautifully in the paintings and on the tile work. But what made this time period so interesting, just like I said, about 40 years is all it was, and it's unique in all of world history. It was probably the largest non-nomadic pastoral society, so people are raising, for the most part, it's cattle. There was a certain amount of sheep being raised, but 85% of it, I would guess, was just cattle. They're raising the cattle for the tallow and the hides, the leather, and they are actually trading with ships that come from all over the world, but particularly Boston and Europe and South America, but a lot for Boston. The ships would come around the end of South America, back up, and to come here, and they'd spend maybe a year going up and down the coast to trade. And remember, in this time period, under Mexico, and before the Americans come, we have no banks, we have no towns, so how are you going to do this business? It's all barter, it's just trade. So these ships come in and they're loaded up with material so the woman can sew their clothes, maybe some beautiful dresses that might have been made in advance, maybe from Paris, but probably clothes, furniture, dishes, because we had no stores here, nothing. So they're going to simply trade. So one of the deals is they come to trade, let's say to come to California, to come to Santa Barbara, and they say, yes, we will give you this, so much for these hides, for this, and maybe there's a shortfall. They want more, the locals want more furniture. And they say, we owe you another 200 hides.
Wow.
They owe it, and they know that that ship is going to take another year. It could be 2 years before they come back. And these people from Boston were just flabbergasted that they could come back here and that the Californian was good for his word. His word was his bond. If they didn't have all this fancy paperwork and master charge and everything else, no checks because you can't, there's no banks. And yes, the person says, I owe you 100 to start off with. In fact, the hides were called the California dollar because we don't have cash, it's just everything is barter. But to go back, here's something else. California is very isolated. First you have the Rockies, then you have the Sierra Madres, so it's difficult to get into California by land. And trying to come up and down the coast, especially to Santa Barbara, can be difficult. But there's not tons of ships in this era because we are so isolated. We have the 4 places where the presidios were, maybe 1 or 2 little areas of just kind of residences, but California is very sparse. So if you were traveling through for whatever reason, you might have come by ship just out of curiosity. You might have come up from Mexico. And you're coming through and you see a vaquero, and you would say, where am I going to stay? The vaquero says, come with me. We go up to the rancho, the man who owns the ranch, and he will say, welcome, stranger. My house is your house. Mi casa es su casa. You're going to stay here. And he tells his vaqueros, I have a guest who's staying at my house. Go out and tell the other neighboring vaqueros, big party at our rancho. Big party at Rancho Graffy. So if I have my Rancho Graffy and I am inviting you to come stay at my ranch, I am not expecting you to pay anything at all. And in fact, if your horse is tired or you don't have a horse, I will probably give you one of my horses, because the generosity of the Californians knew no end. It was just, everything is open. We are taking care of one another.
That sounds good. Where's the address?
And because you are at my house and you are a stranger, you have news of the outside world. We have no towns, we have no TV, radio, even newspapers. We don't know what's going on. If you come from Mexico, that will be interesting. If you come from the east part of the United States, that'll be interesting. If you come from Europe, no matter what, you have information and something interesting to tell us. So the vaqueros who are on these ranches, the land grants would be, I'm sort of backtracking here a second, the land grants that were given from Mexico to people who applied for it were huge. They were 4,000 acres to 48,000 acres. So if I have my ranch, and even if it's only 4,000 acres, that's plenty, and my horsemen, my vaqueros, are working the cattle around here. There's no roads, so they're on a horse all day long, and if I need to get to another ranch, they are going to ride to the end of the ranch and to meet the next people, but there's no fencing involved, right? So it's just wide open, but I recognize the other vaqueros, and they're going to tell their people to say, big party at the rancho. So now when you come to my ranch, all these other people are going to come up, and the sort of the theme that we have behind our Old Spanish Days Fiesta today is based on this. You are the foreign visitor who's coming to our local town, and because of you, we are throwing a party for ourselves. But we're happy that you're here because you are the excuse for it. And today we see that when the tourists come in. But interestingly, you see the way our fiesta is, it isn't designed for a tourist. It's actually designed, everything that you go to is, I mean, tourists can enjoy it, but it's not packaged and aimed just to please a tourist. It's all just about entertaining ourselves, and that we're happy that you're here. Because there are no fences, this brings up some of the tradition of the great horse society that we would have during this Old Spanish Days period. If you don't have any fences, how can you tell which cattle belong to me versus you on your ranch? So this is why they would brand the different cattle. So they would put, maybe it would be either my initials would be branded into my cattle, and the roundup would happen every spring, because now the ships from Boston are coming out because the water is thawing out and they can get out. They're going to come to California starting in the springtime. So we are going to start our cattle slaughtering, and we are going to brand the other cattle. The baby calves will follow mother, so that's how we know what about these new cows, you know, where they're going to belong to. They're going to belong to me. And all the cowboys come together, the vaqueros. The Spanish is vaca for cow, so they say vaqueros. But interesting, they would pronounce it with the Castilian, vaca, vaquero. Later on, when the Americans come in, they mispronounce everything, right? Like in Santa Barbara, Castillo Street and Carrillo Street instead of Castillo and Carril. And they would mispronounce the vaquero, and that's why you get the word buckaroo, because that's the Americans messing up the pronunciation. So when you have the annual roundup, the cowboys will get all the cattle into one area, separate it, so that's where you have the separation when they do those. Even in the rodeos today, all of those things in a rodeo are built on the tradition of, if you're raising cattle, you actually have to do this. You bring them all together, you separate them out, then you have to rope them, tie them, get them down to brand them. And after all that's done, the men are hot and dirty and dusty those days, and they'd start showing off their roping skills, or getting on a horse and going so fast and then stopping it, just seeing if they can impress the girls. And those items of showing off become the modern competition of the rodeo, done in the circle, rodeo, because you're just showing off. So we see, of course, in Old Spanish days to this day, we have the rodeo part of our festival. And the last bit would be on the horses, because if you're on a horse all day long with no roads, and you're chasing after the cattle, and you're dodging bobcats and gopher holes and all the bramble, et cetera, you would get pretty darn good as a horse person. And the people that would visit California in these days were absolutely fascinated to see how incredible people were on their horse. They say, even the woman, you should see how the woman get on a horse and just jump over everything. Boy, they would put our East Coast women that we think are so proper and so good on the horses. Because of course there were no carriages, everything had to be done on a horse. And these expert equestrians, they said their style was not like the Americans who had controlled the horse with the reins. They had a rein, but they are so, sort of at one with the horse, because if you were on the horse all day long, you really could feel everything, and they would just know to nudge the horse with their knee or take their hat off, more sort of a dressage style of horsemanship. And these people were renowned as these excellent horse people. And today in our fiesta, we see that it is the largest equestrian parade, regular parade in the United States, perhaps the world. And we have all different kinds of horses in there. It's the most amazing collection. My friends that come to visit that are horse aficionados are just amazed when they come. They say, we've got the Clydesdales, which is the big, huge horses, big, huge hoofs, and we have miniature horses. We have the Pasafinos, with the beautiful gait, Arabian horses. And one of the early presidentes for our modern day Old Spanish Days festival, a man named Dwight Murphy, he actually breeded the golden palomino back into existence. And of course that was featured prominently at our fiesta, in our fiesta parades. Even today, we see those and we point out that these were developed here in California, Santa Barbara, for the fiestas.
No, that's fascinating history that I'm sure our viewers are going to enjoy, and a lot of it we didn't know, although we are living here for many decades. I thank you very much. Erin, this has been wonderful. Thank you for being on our show and talk about the history that makes our home, Santa Barbara, so special. Thank you.